All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the All Stats No Res podcast, where this week we're going to be having a very special episode about actually talking about stats. As always, I'm one of your hosts, Articulatemus, aka Charlie, and with me are joined HP Munchcraft, Sauron, and Ropsy. How you guys doing today?
I'm doing pretty mediocre. Just didn't get as much stuff done as I wanted to this weekend, and then just arrived back to a big losing fight in one of my Dominion's turns. So I've been better.
I feel that.
I'm doing pretty good. I just got back from vacation this weekend, so I'm feeling pretty good.
Oh yeah, that's awesome. Where'd you go?
Basically down to amusement park area. Had some other attractions, but we didn't.
Sounds fun.
We weren't too busy. We had a pretty chill time, so that was good.
And Sauron, what about you?
I'm doing great. Yeah. Outside of meticulously testing cubes to actually get them to work and not be goddamn useless, great. They are very finicky. Good unit.
Or a bit of finesse, that's for sure.
True. They can like fall on their face versus like just killing whatever you point them at. Sometimes,
listen,
like really weird.
I found the counter to cubes, but I also so they're not like the end all be all, and they're very finicky. But
just drop
if
it.
you get them,
just drop the counter to cubes, like right here in the pod. What counter?
It's trample.
Large trample?
Trample.
You're telling me I could take earth elementals and run over people's cube traps? What is this?
Yep, you can.
So are you trying to tell me that there's some sort of weird triangle between like fire elementals, earth elementals, and cubes where they all kill each other?
Yeah, there is, except no one's discovered it for 5 years, or 10 if you want to include the Dom 4 boomers.
Until now, because you just heard it on the All Stats No Res podcast, your premier Dominions 5 podcast.
it would be funny if the Dominion 6 just like totally got rid of that too.
It'd be funny as hell.
If they nerf cubes into the ground, that would be so tragic, because they probably have been that strong in the game throughout the iterations, and
maybe they'll give us more useful water spells.
No one's noticed it because they're CS4, so in every like stupid AI battle they just lag, and then
I thought they were CS2.
Oh, they're CS2. They quickened to 4.
Yeah,
that's right. They quickened to 4.
That is, yeah. They're really finicky because even if you put your troops that have 10 combat speed all the way in the back and the cubes all the way in the front, your troops, even on hold and attack, will catch up and hit the line before the cubes. So you have to be really careful with the cubes if you don't want to HP right yourself and you don't have archers. So or else
skill issue.
Listen.
This is all in before the inevitable episode on
stats.
Cubes.
Stats. It'll just be I'll just cut together every segment we've spent talking about fucking cubes into one fucking episode. All right, stats.
True.
This is actually the all cubes.
So if you want to know about stats, you can simply watch HP's excellent video on why you should take stats in your blood.
I promise I didn't tell Rob to shill for me.
Why are you shilling right now?
I won't have to say it all.
I did not pay Rob any blood slaves to shill for me. I promise.
Oh yes, Rob loves to be paid in virgin.
He's in the right community for it.
I did just trade Sauron for 100. It's true.
It's true.
You just have to collect, right?
All right. Yeah. So.
All right, getting into the meat of the episode, we're actually going to be talking about our podcast channel namesake, which is going to be Statbless, and maybe just like stats in general.
Okay, so there's going to be 3 versions of stats. The most common version of stats you will see in Dominions is what everyone's rainbow build is, where they take like +2 and probably defense, attack skill, and strength, and then they have blood surge and a bunch of resistance. That's probably the most common bless you will see in Dominions 5 multiplayer, and it's probably something you as the viewer will notice in your game that other players in your games are taking. We're not really about that here on the podcast, but it's a version of stats.
That is called stat res. Because it's got stats and res, and people take it because it's cheap.
Yeah, the other 2 versions of pure stats are going to be your attack skill based and defense based, and then there is the high attack skill plus strength that some players prefer. I personally am kind of against that one at this point in time in my Dominion's career, but that is like the other two polar opposites you'll see. I personally feel like having high defense and high attack is better in combination with Blood Surge than doing the strength builds, but that's going to be your higher stats investments, which is quite costly.
I do want to say as well, it is possible, especially on certain very cheap sacred nations, like I would say Mictlan, maybe Nazca, maybe Gath. There are a few others that could maybe do it, where you take stats as a helpless. You just keep loading them up. You take strength, attack skill, defense skill, as much as you can get, so that basically whenever your troops meet somebody else in combat, they're like a blender.
I also want to mention the heavy stat light res variant, which is, I think it's different from the all threes rainbow stat res, but if you've seen Johnny or Nick Knight in a game where they have like a very heavy investment Statbless, a bunch of +4s and like a +6 strength or something, and then they also have like 4 resistances or something. Like that is another build that will take your scales down into the dumpster, but it deserves mention because it is how the middle-aged Anakites become unkillable to Calum.
Yeah, I mean,
well, I guess.
I think the whole reason why, like, at least I've kind of favored just going stats for a lot of builds in Dominions is, one, it's very easy to play. You can make red eye arrows. You just, like, set up a simple blessing script, and then you can, like, run at provinces. And two, it's very strong and versatile in the mid and late game. It's got a lot more power, and you'll notice it earlier rather than with, like, res, where you can take a lot of res, and you're not sure when you're getting that value throughout the game, especially when you're paying for stuff like PR or CR, and the other player never casts any of these spells, especially like, you know, you're paying to hold all these reses, and then you might not even get value throughout the game, but you're paying for like the potential of it. So I've kind of
to add on to that. I mean, you're really not going to know who you're going to be fighting against in terms of your first, second, third opponents, etc. So. Yeah, it's a lot of investment to get rainbow res across the board, and you might not get any value out of it.
Yeah.
If I could interject briefly, in that debate, probably the resistance that you're going to see the most often is going to be poison resistance, simply because basically every other stat-related path that could also give resistances, right? You have competition there. Whereas the only thing that poison resistance is really competing with is like hit points or incarnates. So it's probably the easiest for a lot of people to fit into their builds.
PR is also a higher value because a lot of it's incremental damage. So even small amounts of PR will do a lot for you.
That's true. Like 5 CR isn't going to stop Frozen Heart necessarily, or even Lethal Flames, but 5 PR can hold off Foul Vapors for a really long time.
Well, I wouldn't say 5. I would say 10 certainly does the job, but 5, I think you will notice. But it's easier to paint, I think, poison rather than all the other reses, because you can get up to 10.
Because of Nature 1 as well?
Well, not just that. It's just how the resistance spells work in Dominions. You get up to 10 in combat.
That's true. Yeah.
And you only can get up to 5 in the normal game with shock, with fire, and with CR. So poison is kind of this weird thing where it's like
Serpent's Blessing is just stronger than the other resistance.
Yeah, it's just better because you get 10 versus getting 5, and 5 is very minuscule. There's probably more of a conversation here for, well, why don't people take a bunch of 5s? And they honestly just haven't gotten to that point. I don't think the community has evolved to a state where people are having these conversations, and pretender design is generally kind of rushed in a lot of cases. So there's not too much thought.
I don't know. 5s kind of seem like, in some ways, they can seem to me like a worst of both worlds, where you have to pay for that extra point on top of whatever else you're doing, which can sometimes be the most expensive point you're paying for, right? And then in a lot of situations, like if you're Pan, right, 5 FR on a White Centaur doesn't stop a fire elemental from killing it.
Yeah, but you wouldn't take it.
Take it an extra hit, but you know what I mean.
I think the conversations you're taking 5 is when you're asking yourself with your magic of your nation. So let's say you're like fire based.
So you would stack them together.
Yeah, you plan to go up like alteration or enchantment anyways because of your magic, and then you want to paint this to increase the resistance, so you get double the value of I've paid for less res here, but if I need more, I'm already going up this tree. So like, for example, how I played Marignon is I personally kind of metagame cold resist. I don't even take it because it's so there's like 3 spells that are actually going to hit you, and there's not a lot of nations in MA who are going to really be applying it, but like not including Frozen Heart because that's a later spell. So I plan on rushing Alteration, and then and because I'm going up Alteration, I'm going to hit that 5 CR, and I want to be at Alt 5. So if I need it for against like Freezing Mist, I'm already rushing up that path, and like I can just paint it if I need it, and it gives more value to my Witch Hunter, who normally doesn't have a lot of jobs in the first place because he's shit. But we already talked about this in the first.
Witch Hunter's a pog. We thought we already said
Let's not get into that again. So
to get back onto it, then why all stats and no res?
Oh, okay. Why all stats and no res? Because it makes your dudes fight better. So
you're just getting like almost 100% value like all the time.
This is going to be a slight recap of things I've already covered in that other video, but in case you don't know about how combat stats and the DRN probability works, when you fight, your attack rolls and your damage rolls are 2d6 opposing, so each side rolling 2d6 against each other, which sounds like a lot of randomness, but in fact it's reducing the randomness by rolling so many dice that it ends up with a very flat probability curve. So increasing your combat stats by just a few points can really greatly increase the percentage that you'll hit someone and the percentage that you'll damage someone, and vice versa. Increasing just a few points of defense will, greatly increase the chance that the enemy misses you or decrease their chances of success. So
to put it in perspective, I guess, could I?
Yeah, absolutely.
So correct me if I'm wrong here, but very roughly speaking, because of how DRN works, it's hard to get the percentages don't exactly work how you might expect on dice.
Right.
But having +2 attack, you're roughly twice as likely to hit, I believe.
Not quite. It goes up
Depends on the base
a little
value,
less than 50 to a little more than 60. I think like going up to 3
let's say
4,
you have 10 versus 10. You have a baseline neutral position.
Yeah.
So then it would be 50% more, or?
Yeah, it would be about 50% more for the third.
And then if you have +2 defense,
right, then they would be 50% less to hit you, and then those.
So those numbers are actually closer to 60%. So when you stack both of them, the effect that you're actually getting is much closer to just having body ethereal in a fight without magic weapons.
Right.
Which is where suddenly, I can pay for body ethereal, which I can paint on anyway, by the way. Or I can have +2 attack and defense, which are very hard to apply. You have to have quickness, and you can stack both of those higher than that from your bless, and you can put quickness on top of them. So you can. There's a couple of reasons there. So you can quickly make up in combat effectiveness for not taking an incarnate, and they're very difficult to apply in combat, which many incarnates are actually very easily replicable with, in combat magic. Like protection does the job of barkskin.
It's just
right?
It's just
so much. It's just so much. So much harder to get +6 attack as compared to putting it in your blast.
Right, you would need to use
if you stick it. Yeah, like there's so much inherent value of taking stats because, as Rob and HP said, you can't apply them really in the game outside of quickness. This means that the stats have such a much higher value than they would otherwise, because once you're in the game, you can't boost any of you can't paint +2 attack unless you have quickness, right? So if you want +4, you have to do that in Pretender design, and it only applies to your sacreds. So it's very appealing to take stats, and it gives your build a lot more flexibility, in my opinion, with the creative stuff you can do in the game rather than taking an incarnate, which can easily overlap. Barkskin is the most common one, but even stuff like Fortitude, which is Wave Warriors, or stuff like
Regen.
Regen.
Very common.
Yeah, Regen's Enchantment 3, but you only can apply it in one square with an N3. So you can get all of these incarnates, but you don't have to pay for them, in your bless. There's advantage depending on the nation, and obviously it's going to depend, but I feel like stats are way more appealing because it's just easier to play in general.
Yeah. Basically, to summarize and break down, we've got they apply effects that are hard to apply otherwise, and then after that, which is something Sauron said, and then after that, they just make your guys win fights against their guys, which I know you want to not be just mashing dudes together in Dominions, but it gives you much more options and opportunity when your guys are just going to win the fight and your opponent has to think of a way to counter your basic fucking sacreds, as opposed to, you have resists and, like, sure, your guys aren't easy to counter, but do they really need a specific counter to your guys if they are able to just beat them in melee combat? Like...
They're also stats are very easy to expand with. You can take especially when you hit that +4 threshold. In my opinion, I really just like only +2. I think hitting 4 is very important. Both for like you could get away with 3 defense, but I think 4, 3, and 5 or 5 is better.
It also really depends on the chassis. Some chassis have exceptional attack or defense skill, so you can kind of get away with a little less on those.
We should caveat that all of this is not only chassis dependent, but like when we say like +4 or whatever, you want to be building off an 11 plus base generally when you're building stats. If you're trying to build off of like 8s and 9s, like you have like a Pale One guy, that's generally not going to be very successful. Or if you're like building, you don't want to build stats on like a Burning One who's going to go berserk and then get a bunch of minuses to his defense and pluses to attack, which will kind of overwhelm your bless. You want to pay attention.
You would
to that.
carry
focus on your strengths.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, focusing on the strengths is definitely an easier thing. I have a different perspective on stats in the sense that if you take high stats and then you combine it with a commander and then a weapon on top of point buffs, you even can use really small base chassis like priest. This is my own testing. I don't necessarily recommend it, but I think there's more potential with commanders specifically and army thugs if you're using even a very low value, because you can add on top of those weapons and point buffs to further increase the stats.
Right.
But for units specifically, +11 is generally where you want to be looking at. Or, with cavalry, they already have generally like base 16 to 18 defense. So you only need a little bit to hit 21. And that's kind of that, or even, like 21 is like a sweet spot for like defense. So like you don't need to take a lot of defense, but you can boost up attack, Yeah.
And so for like, for elf cavalry, when you take stats, you don't actually need to take all that much defense to make them nigh unhittable. That like +3 from one stack of defense will do it. But you only need to go higher than that if you expect the enemy is attack stacking, which,
Do we think that in the current meta that people are not valuing stats as highly is just because it's like, maybe it's an issue with the minions and being able to parse out just how much impact you're getting from each stat point? It's kind of hard to tell sometimes when you're actually looking at the battles, just how much it's doing for you.
I would actually say that stats are pretty highly valued at the moment. It's really just it's a spectrum of how much people want to invest into it on their particular build. But I think that stats are actually pretty highly valued for a lot of it.
Mostly the hybrid builds, though.
I still think they're undervalued. But
I'd agree.
a lot of people liked my video, so maybe they're not anymore. But I
think it depends a little on the play style of the particular person as well.
In games, I usually see like jank, which is fine because you have to experiment in order to find builds, or I see pure scales, which makes me want to cry most of the time, or I see like a typical 3-3-3 stat res build, and then occasionally I'll see like a repel build or a stat build. But I generally see like maybe one or two other stat builds per game, and I think that's low considering how I think they beat resist builds in early fights.
Okay, I was gonna say I do see a decent amount of attack, like 2 to 4, and then high strength builds like 4 to 8. I feel like that's pretty common, but I personally just don't think it's good. Not long-standing players like Not Lola really recommend that a lot of the time, and I've used his builds, and I feel like from my anecdotal experience, it just doesn't work for me personally, and I just like watch my like sacreds. They finally have their job. They find the guy they're supposed to bonk over the head because I don't have anyone who can hit this giant, and they get into melee and they die. So it's like,
yeah.
So I don't like it.
I do like those builds. However, I think that like, you know, if you're taking heavy attack and strength, like, it's pretty easy to add on some defense and then just make them an all-round good stat build. Usually, like I said, there are exceptions, like the Agarthan, not the middle-aged guys, but the like ancient ones in the early age that you get any forts or whatever, the big dirtle guys, where they just kind of want attack skill and less, like, more than anything else, because you want their high damage attack to hit, and then it gives them a defensive ability in repel, and then that adds most of the value that you're getting out of them. You're like not really getting a lot out of adding defense to that, like 8 defense with a buckler or whatever it is. It's really low numbers, and then you're
it is 10.
Oh, it's 10? 10 with the buckler, though.
Yeah.
So
yes, that is correct. With
yeah,
the buckler, it is
10 defense with the buckler, and if you don't hit the 2 parry on that buckler, you're hitting at like an 8 defense. So, you're not adding a lot.
My man is carrying a manhole cover, and he's calling it a buckler.
Yeah, you're not getting a lot out of that, and then you generally don't get a lot out of strength on high strength chassis, though that is I have to very carefully caveat that because there are very specific breakpoints you can hit, and I'm sure Arco will say something about this or whatever, but there are very specific breakpoints you can hit when you have a high strength chassis and you crank its strength up even higher to where you are hitting through certain chassis iron skin plus armor on their thugs, and you're hitting so hard that you're like regularly going through shield prot on certain chassis so that their effective defense is much lower than their actual defense score is. But that's very weird and specific. Generally, you want to pump your strength on your low mid strength guys, and then you don't want to pump your strength on your like giants who already have plenty of it.
I feel like no, you go.
Okay, I did want to bring up, when we're talking about stat builds, there is one very, very common, some would even say necessary addition, which is not really stat related. That you will, I think this might actually be the most popular bless in the whole game, maybe besides PR, which is magic weapons.
Yeah.
Sure.
Magic weapons is really just, you can almost take it as a given in a lot of stat builds because it's so good at solving the issue of, okay, so my enemy saw I have stats, and then they put some defense on so that I can't hit them as often, right? Because of Fog Warriors or Ethereal, or maybe they're trying to prot stack with invulnerability of some kind or whatever. Which is really the only 3 things that it counters. So when I say whatever, that's
hold on. Very, very importantly, magic weapons as part of both stat builds and stat res builds. The reason why they're ubiquitous is because one of the easy army counters that lets you dump gems into combat power is elementals. And then air elementals and fire elementals are ethereal. So if your guys do not have magic weapons, then you run onto air elementals or fire elementals and bad things happen regardless of your stats, basically.
Elemental
But
type.
if you do have magic weapons, even if you don't have stats, or even if you don't have resists, a lot of people think, oh, you need fire resist to fight fire elementals. It's like, no, you can take some damage and just chunk it down very quickly.
Yeah, just
if you
don't
have
bring
magic
daggers,
weapons.
and you should be good.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, because fire elementals, when you hit them, it's not the fire attack that's really killing you. It's the fire shield that's really killing your guys. And how fire shield works is it cares about the length of your weapon. So your 0 and 1s are going to blow up like nothing on fire shield. This is why, if any of you have seen Sai's build, where he talks about Nazca at the launch of Dom 5, he talks about needing fire res, and it's just because of the niche cases of fighting fire elementals. Fire shield is something that not a lot of people think about, but it's what kills a lot of their sacreds when they're not. So you got to be careful what you're running into. So.
That's why fire elementals are so strong versus undead as well.
Yeah, because the skeletons will run in and I'll try to surround and hit the elemental. They'll miss 80%.
Well, they'll eventually get them,
shots,
but
and they'll fry.
It depends on if the fire elemental has any kind of buffs. With buffs, they really don't do very well at all.
Let me tell you, if you can't buff those fire elementals, then there is a threshold for how many skeletons kills your fire elementals, and because if you play against Scalaria, I've learned the hard way, it is not cost effective.
Yeah, that's true. Shiniyama can do the same thing. It's pretty funny, actually.
Oh, what? Have so many fucking Bakusho? That sounds ineffective from the Shiniyama's perspective, but
probably.
I mean, it works. It works though.
If you run over, have so many fucking goblins, you run over the wow.
So in a lot of cases, just take magic weapons as a given. The people will find a way to fit them in on a lot of builds, even even builds where they probably shouldn't try and fit them in, like an Awake or something. Yeah. They'll try and fit them in. So magic weapons very common. Take them kind of as a given on a lot of stat builds, simply because unless the nation already has a source of magic weapon sacreds, it's a good solution to a lot of threat vectors that people will try and bring against you.
Sure.
I think there's a reason not to run them, but it has to be hyper specific on your stat build. So if you're really trying to use army thugs and you're trying to have your army thugs do the killing, you can sometimes get away with skipping them, but I don't recommend it. But it really depends on the
We're going to have to get... You might as well practice, because allegedly in Dom 6, magic weapons are going to become incarnate, so...
Hey, I'm already using...
Yeah, a tremendous nerf.
I'm already using army thugs, and apparently they're adding more AoE 1 spells like Keen Blades or what, which is AP. What is that? Weapons of Sharpness AoE 1.
Yeah, that
allegedly they're making that a buff.
I'm gonna leave Dom 6 speculation mostly out, so we don't get too far.
Fair enough.
Because there's a lot we don't know.
I do think army thugs with stats though are super good. Like you take just +4, +5 stats. You take 2 strength and blood surge. Like your army thugs will do so much work.
And your counter thugs as well.
Yeah, your counter thugs and any sort of guy that's sacred holding your bless is so much power, especially early and mid game, and it's so easy to enable them.
Right.
It's fun as hell too.
Yeah, it's
hell watching your heroes.
Yeah, I might have a few hero mooch that have not died for 16 plus turns, who've just walked around like absolute madmen.
So I want to transition from that, because you mentioned blood surge, and tying directly into the stats conversation. I personally prefer blood surge, but I know some people stand by having +2 strength multiple times through the blood path just to stack perma strength.
Absolutely.
I think so blood surge is really interesting. So at the launch of 5, everyone was and their mom was taking it every game. And then I started coming to the conclusion of, why am I paying for Blood Surge if my elites or whatever aren't killing sometimes? Like in the elite on lead combat, Blood Surge doesn't always fire, so it's a waste of 4 points. Why not take the strength? And now, fast forwarding to today, where I'm like, now I'm throwing in army thugs. Well, your army thug that is holding your item is always going to fucking be killing people because he has the weapon, he has your bless, and you're probably going to point buff him. So he is almost certainly going to get the buff off. So there's so much more value for Blood Surge, in my opinion, if you're using army thugs, and there's so much less value for Blood Surge if you're just using the Sacreds, because of when you have your elite on lean combat, that stat is not necessarily going to get fired, or it might get fired so little times it doesn't matter.
Right. So I do want to expound on that point of Blood Surge not firing is being bad when it doesn't fire. So if you look at your chassis and you look at, like, do you want Blood Surge? If you're taking a chassis that's got like a lance charge or is a giant or has a very good chance of killing people, or if you're an explicit repel build where building attack skill is also the defense you're building, so you want that extra attack skill versus indies, then in those situations, or as Sauron said, when you're using a lot of thugs and army thugs, in those situations, Blood Surge is very, very good. However, if you use a build like you mentioned earlier that Lola likes to use and that I also like to use, which is more attack strength oriented, where you're just trying to take more efficient, cheaper sacreds that are not the best and then trade up with them. Like if you take like the crappy halberdier on late age Marignon and you just crank his attack and strength up so he actually murders things very efficiently, where you're trading your like shitty 20 gold sacred for someone else's 70 gold sacred, obviously you're coming in ahead. But on those builds you don't want Blood Surge because you want all your build to be focused on getting the kill in the first place. You don't want to be in a situation where you have a Blood Surge but you can't trigger it. You can't kill the enemy's elite, so you can't ever trigger your Blood Surge and then it's wasted. A lot of what happened early in Dom 5 was people would just take naked Blood Surge because it was like the cheapest way of getting stats, and they'd take it and they'd have no plan of how it's going to trigger every fight. So when they went up against enemy sacreds with maybe even just a little light stat res build, they would just die without ever triggering Blood Surge because they had no mechanism for actually getting kills, except against Chaff.
I do want to point out that Blood Surge does have a peripheral benefit for mage priests who are getting kills, because then that reinvig actually kicks in.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It does give a defense skill as well, I believe.
Yes.
It does. It gives +1 defense.
It's some way similar to Berserk, but it doesn't actually have any negatives, which I think is important to mention.
I like Blood Surge.
We should probably mention the stats that are there, but we haven't touched on. So there are builds where you can play around Undying and HP. We haven't talked about them. Precision is another stat, but that's not normally what a stats build will run. That's more
a mage build.
Yeah. So, and I'm still on the fence about stacking precision.
So yeah, you can stack precision, but that does very little, even on like archer builds. Like your archers
what you would use precision for is on AoE spells. You want the diffusion from the target to be lower, so that they're still clipping stuff with the AoE spell.
Basically, taking points of precision from base 10, every effective 1 point increases the square your mage can be from the target to effectively land his spell every time. So normally at base 10, your effective range for a mage is like 3 squares or something that he will always hit his spell. And this is at base 10. Every extra point gives you another square. Accurate. It's more or less the basic.
But you always have a chance to miss, is my understanding. Even if you should have a theoretical.
Yeah, there's a deviation.
There's like a built-in deviation that can always happen. And
yeah, but we're not including the deviation.
At base 10, it's closer to 4 or 5, but whatever. The point is,
your what you're doing effectively is you're increasing the effective range of
The
the
way that
mage, not the
precision-
actual range of the mage.
So the way that precision works is that when you're firing at something that's relatively, I don't know, 20 or 30 tiles away, the likelihood of you hitting more than like 2 or 3 tiles from your target is actually still very low, but the likelihood of actually hitting the target square is also low. So what ends up happening is if you really want to focus on precision and put up wind guide and have like +4 in your bless or whatever, your mages will be more likely to hit closer to that target and less likely to hit 3 or 4 tiles away, which can still be effective against groups of enemies, but is obviously not ideal. So whatever. Precision maybe has some uses. I don't think it's been explored.
Even though it is a stat that you can bless, we generally aren't talking about precision when we're talking about a stat bless. It is a variant of mage blessing, I would say.
That is true. Same thing is true of reinvigoration, I would say.
Yes.
So popular player 7th Path, I'll try to wrap this up. He recommends if you really want to get into that and you're painting Eagle Eyes or Wind Guide or whatever, he recommends like +6 precision, at least 6 with like Farcaster, and then your guys will actually be landing stuff. But I'm not the biggest fan of recommending a Mage Plus, but if you want to do a Mage Plus, start from there, get your Farcaster, get your +6 precision, and you will notice your guys will just be landing evos supposedly.
Right. If you want to make your evos land better. So
that's how you cast Maws of the Earth right there.
Maws of the Earth.
Make sure you use Advance and Cast. Well, I guess you don't need to use Advance and Cast if
not
you do
with that. Not with Farcaster then.
Hey, it's one of your All Stats No Res hosts, HP Munchcraft here. Just letting you know, I am breaking this episode up into 2 parts for basically editing convenience purposes. The next part should be out either the same day or one day after the first part, but I'm going to wrap up this part of it here, and we will continue the discussion in the next video where we will start off talking about HP and Undying.